Well, thank you everyone for joining us for the latest in the MillerKnoll Insight series online, but not only online, in person as well. So thank you to those that have joined us here in person. My name is Mark Catchlove and I lead the MillerKnoll Insight Group. And in case you don't know MillerKnoll, we're a family of brands, and all these brands design and manufacture products for places where people live, where they get healed, and where they learn, and but especially where they work. So today's speaker is Dr. Sally Augustin, who is a workplace psychologist. I'm going to be focusing on a theme that we asked her to speak on, which is well-being, connection, and change. Sally, over to you. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you very much, Mark. It's nice to be able to have a chance to speak with you all today. First, I'll give you an idea of our plan for the day. We're going to talk about designing to support well-being, connection, and change. And we'll go through the material, and then there'll be time for questions at the end. And I'll introduce myself to you very briefly. I'm an applied psychologist, and what I do for a living is make neuroscience-informed, design-related recommendations to people who are developing places and objects and services. And if we're wanting to design places that do things like support employee well-being, foster connection, and help people positively navigate change, we really have to think about what makes people people, what they value, and what motivates them. And when psychologists go to work to answer this question, they find that there are really three core motivations that humans have, and happily design can support all of them, as we'll talk about in some detail in moments to come. So the humans' three core motivations are to be competent, to be skilled at what they do, to be capable. The environment can help them succeed in what they wish, the activities they wish to perform. Another core motivator is autonomy. People like a comfortable level of control over their physical environment. And third, people value relatedness. That's the tech scientific term, but that really means being able to interact with others when they choose to, how they choose to do so. And so undergirding our whole conversation today is going to be discussions of how people can feel more capable, feel like they have comfortable control, and feel connected to others, all in terms of design and support for those activities. So the first major topic we're going to cover today is designing to support employee well-being. And the research shows consistently over and over again that design can have a significant influence on our mental and physical health, and through that, our well-being. And we find cross-culturally, worldwide, wherever you test it, that when people feel they have a comfortable level of autonomy, control, as we were talking about before, connection with others, and that they're competent, their well-being is enhanced. So that's something we find cross-culturally. And when people have a good level of well-being, they're experiencing more pleasant emotions than unpleasant ones. They're engaged in activities that they themselves find interesting, and they're more satisfied with their lives. And for the purpose of our discussion today, they're more satisfied with their work life. So we've had a chance to talk about what well-being is. Now, there are a number of benefits to people having a feeling of well-being. People with higher levels of well-being, they're really just, you could think of them as better corporate citizens. They're more likely to seek out opportunities to socialize, as well as establish relationships with others and to be successful in those relationships. So you can see encouraging well-being all relates to fostering connections. We're going to be talking about the same topics multiple times today because all of this is interrelated. And just to finish off, thinking about benefits of well-being, when people have good levels of well-being, their mental performance improves, and not only individually, but in groups. at an organizational level, which is very important. And happily, also, people with a higher level of well-being are apt to be in better physical health. Now that we'll get into the actual nitty-gritty of designing to support well-being. And first, we should cover a few general topics. Salary, once it hits an acceptable level, really doesn't tie very closely to employee well-being, but all sorts of organizational policies actually do. And another thing to get out of the way early on is that's really how people perceive in situations that influences their well-being, not necessarily any sort of objective measures of those situations. And so researchers have found that design can support positive mental health and well-being by doing the following sorts of things. It does so when it provides a comfortable level of environmental control, again, something we've alluded to earlier, when it supports positive communication, when the design aligns with the task at hand, and when it encourages cognitive restoration or people to feel mentally refreshed. And when design doesn't do this, people feel stressed, and stress is really the enemy of well-being. When people feel stressed, their well-being falls apart. And it's interesting that when people in my world research burnout and how the physical environment can influence burnout, these same factors that we've just talked about that have been shown to enhance well-being, rear their heads again. People are less burned out when the environment supports what they need to do, when they feel they have control, when it's sending them positive messages, when they can interact socially with others when they wish, etc. So you can see burnout and well-being are really closely related. And now we're going to talk about each of these factors in turn. So first, we're going to talk about design providing people with a comfortable a level of control over their physical environment. This is important for our mental health, and again, doing so optimizes our well-being. So, people can be provided with control in a number of ways. They can turn on and off lights, open windows, fiddle with drapes, and in an activity-based workplace, for example, they would also have the ability to choose, where they work. So there's all sorts of ways you can provide people with control, but you want to make sure you don't overwhelm them with choices, because too many choices is stressful. Remember, stress is, when people are stressed, well, their well-being level has to be low then. So you want to give people, say, 4 to 6 options for what they can do in a space, not an unlimited number. So like in the conference room, like where I am right now, you would want to have, say, 4 to 6 lighting presets in terms of color and intensity of light that people could choose from based on how you expect people will be using this setting. If you give people lighting dials that they can turn through 360 degrees of intensity and color, that's just way too stressful, way too much. So choice, but within logical limits, thinking about how people are going to use the space. And it's important to remember that these things I'm saying about giving people a choice, these aren't just like ideas that like psychologists have sort of dreamed up somewhere. When you actually look at people's brains, when they're given choices, the reward centers in their brains light up. So, we're really into choice, and there's physiological evidence to indicate that. And I'd be remiss if I didn't mention that not only does personal control help us with well-being, but it'll also help directly with task performance, job satisfaction, feeling creative, all sorts of things. Now, the second factor we talked about that boosts well-being is people pulling positive messages from the world around them. And this can also sometimes sound like psych gobbledygook, but we're going to try to make it a little more concrete today. People are always thinking about the spaces that they're in and trying to really decipher what's going on there. And when the messages they pull are positive for them as individuals or for groups that they're members of, well, that's great for well-being. So, like we could think about the conference table we're all sharing today. We could look at the materials and think about, well, does the choice of this material by whoever supplied this space indicate they respect me, want me to be able to do a good job, etc.? Or is it something sort of chintzy that they found at a discount store and therefore they don't respect me at all? So, we're always looking, we're always interpreting. And when given a choice, people choose to surround themselves with objects that are consistent with what they think of as positive aspects of themselves. If they think of themselves as a great employee and they've won a bunch of different awards for being a great employee, they'll make sure you see the plaques. If they see themselves as primarily like a champion sailor, you'll see their trophies. So people want to surround themselves with things that send positive messages about themselves as they interpret that. And when they get the chance to do that, their well-being is improved. And, but there is something of a cultural component to interpreting these messages also, because pretty much anything can be either a positive message or a negative message, depending on where you are, who you work with, that kind of thing. So like in some organizations, if your seat, where you work, is close to the boss, well, that's a positive message sometimes. It means you're doing a great job and the boss wants to associate with you. But in other organizations, having the seat near the boss, very bad. That means you need help. Who wants to be acknowledged publicly as needing help? So, if your organizational culture indicates that your position on the floor isn't so positive, you pull negative messages, you get stressed, bad things happen. We could go through all sorts of different aspects of the environment. It could be what kind of chair you have, it could be the aesthetics of your space, etc. All is subject to interpretation. And as it turns out, we're really very good at reading the signals that are sent to us by the physical environment. And there's a body of research that indicates we actually trust the signals we pull from the physical environment much more than we do anything that our employer chooses to say in a mission statement, a value statement. All those words, easy to change. But when you lock something into the physical world, well, that has real meaning to people. And there's also a body of research that indicates that the symbolic meanings we get from our workspace, like what we read into our position on the floor and all of that, have a more important effect on our performance than any individual physical element that we might encounter, like the lighting, etc. So, these messages matter, and research with users will help you determine what they're actually pulling out of either a current space or a space you want to provide. Now, we also need to think about, in terms of well-being, support for the activity at hand. So the types of tasks that we're doing have a direct effect on the sort of space in which we should be doing them. And when everything lines up, when we have the right sort of space for what we're trying to do, well, our well-being is enhanced, along with our mental health. So in short, when we're doing cognitive work, not heavy metal work, some sort of Freudian slip there, but anyway, heavy mental work requires a lot of focus, concentration. We'll do a better job, our performance will improve, and therefore our well-being will improve when we're in a space that has less going on, because we need to really harness all our mental processing power for that work that requires concentration. We can't have any of it sort of lost trying to figure out what Susie and Betsy in the corner are actually talking about, or, if the building is on fire, or if someone's just screwed up their lunch in the cafeteria, whatever, And distractions eat up mental processing power. That's bad for our performance as well as our well-being. But conversely, when we're doing something that we've done a bunch of times before, like or that's easy for whatever reason, like maybe answering routine emails, it's great to do that in a space that's got more going on, say, even like a break area, because all that activity around you keeps you from basically zoning out and failing at that easy task. So we want to line things up, and when you do, well-being is improved. So we can make this so much more concrete. Last year when I was here, yes, do not worry. Reading each of these boxes is not going to be important. We're just going to talk about them generally. Last year, when I had an opportunity to speak here, I talked about places where people are more likely to think creatively. And obviously, this is an example of lining up task with place to improve well-being. So I'll just give you, since I've presented all these boxes, we might as well, at least say a phrase about some of them. So you're more likely to think creatively in a place that features the color green on walls, wherever. Green is a great boost for creative thinking, seeing green. You're more likely to think creatively in a place that's filled with natural light, but is clutter-free. That doesn't mean stark or bare. It just means not cluttered. We could talk for a whole hour about what is clutter, what's not, but I think like the Supreme Court Justice of the United States who said, you know pornography when you see it. You actually know clutter when you see it. We don't have to spend time. We're more likely to think creatively in a space with warmer, slightly dimmer light, a place that has more curved lines than straight lines. So like this podium that I'm speaking from today has rounded corners. That would be great in a space for creative thinking as opposed to more rectilinear, right-angle-y thing. Green leafy plants are great for creative thinking. So is the ability to walk. When we can walk, our creativity improves. Like we've all had to take some literature class somewhere along the line and think about some writer that really doesn't come up in life, like Proust or something. And, the literature professor will say sooner or later that when Proust had a mental block, he would take a walk. Well, there's actually science to support that. There we go. Yes, every famous writer seems to go for a lot of walks, which may be a lesson to all of us. The space needs to seem well proportioned. Like ceilings of about 10 feet tall are good. And also, in places where people are more likely to think creatively, they have more options for where they work. Sometimes just getting up from where you are and go into another place can be enough to encourage creative thinking. And if your goal is creative thinking, that means it would boost well-being. But we do have to be realistic about what design can do for us in terms of creative thinking. I can't tell you how many times I've gone through spaces for creative thinking with people. I can, in my own home, paint my office the right color, have it just the right level of visual complexity, put in the right number of plants, on and on and on. And I am never going to be thinking creatively about quantum physics, quantum mechanics, because I know nothing about it. So, we always have to keep in mind that there's a number of forces besides just pure design that influence any outcome that we really care about. And now the awful slide with all the blocks is gone. back to a more straightforward image. Now, when we're thinking about designing to support well-being, one of the things I mentioned towards the end of that discussion was the fact that we need to feel mentally refreshed. Our brains do get tired when we need to concentrate and focus. And not only does our performance and well-being get degraded when our brains are tired, but other things that are undesirable happen, like we get irritable, don't socialize with people the way we should, we snip and complain, and again, that affects not only well-being, but also fostering connection with others. So again, an example of all the sections of this talk today are really interrelated. And we've all heard about how looking at nature helps us, restore our mental activity levels, helps us feel refreshed. And again, as with all the things I've been talking about today, there is real physiological evidence to support this link between seeing nature and mental refreshment. It's not something like some psychologists has just dreamed up because they like to walk in nature or something like that. But when you actually look at people's brains using MRI machines, you can see that seeing nature does actually cause changes in people's brains that indicate that they're refreshed. So, mainly what people think about when they think about mental refreshment is nature. You really want scenes that people feel like they could step into. Like if you've seen the movie Mary Poppins, remember the scene when they drive, Bert draws images on the sidewalk with chalk, and then Mary Poppins and the kids step into them. That's really the kind of nature image you want, not one that looks like a barrier between you and the nature, etc. But we can really go beyond that. Things like seeing visible water, man-made, natural, desktop bubbler, fountain outside, gently moving river. All of that is really great for mental refreshment, but you want water that's moving peacefully, calm water, not water that looks like a problem that you're going to have to deal with sooner or later, like no rapids, no hurricanes, nothing, gentle, smooth, burbling brooks. And you see the same sort of effects in terms of mental refreshment when people are looking at wood with visible grain, when they're looking at plants, when they're looking at certain fractal patterns, and when they're hearing nature sounds, for example. But we also should point out that some people do choose to divert themselves when they need mental refreshment, and they'll do things like go do something creative. Maybe they will have a snack, maybe they'll socialize, and that can help them get in a good condition to return to work as well. Now, in our last slide that relates to designing for well-being, we can talk about links between design and physical health. And here I'm not going to talk about things like off-gassing and things like that. That's all pretty straightforward. I'm going to talk about the psychological links between design and health. When we're in a more positive mood, our immune system functions more effectively. When we're in a positive mood, our brain actually sends like chemical signals to systems in our body that deal with immunity, and we're better at fighting disease, and being physically healthier is an important component of well-being. And so any stressors are real negatives here, and they can be physical, they can be symbolic, that having the desk in the wrong place, etc. But we can even go farther than that and think about things like perceptions really influence how stressed people feel. There was a really cool and relatively famous study where two groups of people heard exactly the same noise. And some people were told it was nature, and other people were told it was industrial and a machine. And the people who were told it was nature, after they listened for a few minutes, they were mentally refreshed, not the other group. So again, perceptions are really key here. And yeah, people are really sort of fascinating beasts when you get right down to it. But again, topic for another day. So, you can also do things like design so people are more likely to eat healthy food. Like when you can see like nature art, like landscapes, you eat you make healthier choices. I mean, we're really, like I said, pretty fascinating. You can provide people with opportunities to nap at work. You can build in activity. That walking is good for people's physical health, just as it's good for their creativity. So now we'll move on to our second major topic, which is designing to support, to foster connections between individuals. And the very first thing we should talk about, again, gets back to signaling by the physical environment. Nonverbal messages are really key to the bonds between people, the social connections between people, particularly backstage messages when you're thinking about people bonding to an organization. Like what everybody in the public sees is not nearly as meaningful to employees as what's behind the scenes. And when an organization signals its culture, what's important to it, through the spaces that it provides, like maybe it feels really egalitarian, everybody actually has exactly the same workplace, or it's really into helping the environment to easy choices, so everything is earth friendly. Anyway, but when an organization signals its culture, there's a greater sense of community among those who are present, and happily for the organization, even beyond that sense of community, their income goes up. You know, when we're thinking about how we can communicate through design, it goes all the way from the site where you choose to work. Are you in a trendy part of town or not? You can think about design and furnishings. You can think about level of maintenance, etc. And in terms of socializing, I want to bring up personalizing again, because, you know, personalizing helps people start conversations with each other, right? Like if you see I have sailing trophies and you like to sail, we could talk about that. But it's meaningful on an even greater level because when you can see how I've personalized a space, you get clues about me, that kind of clues we're not apt to discuss much among ourselves, but that are really meaningful, that are socialized into us by our culture. For example, if you see from pictures that the poses always seem sort of formal, you may infer that I'm a sort of formal person. And then you, as someone who's interacting with me, knows to keep a little more distance, you know, because people who are more formal like bigger personal spaces. And when we're at preferred personal spaces from each other, you know, we connect better. So, you know, the pictures you put up matter beyond what they signal you like to eat and things like that. For people to connect, in the world as we live now, they really do need to be nearby each other, at least from time to time. And, you know, it's interesting, even today, even, you know, post-COVID and all that, the farther apart people sit, the farther apart their usual locations at work are, the further apart, the less likely they are to talk or even to email each other. And when you're thinking about laying out a floor plan, you really want to think about not only, you know, who people talk to now, who they think they need to talk to, but you as the designer need to think about who should be connecting to add the most value to the organization. And one of the reasons that co-location, being nearby, is important is because humans communicate in all sorts of ways, many ways beyond just the words that we say. For example, whether I make eye contact with you or not, whether I hold that eye contact is really meaningful, how far I stand from you. If I violate your personal space and get right up in your face, as we say in the States, that's a super aggressive move. That's really bad in terms of, you know, forming connections. But, you know, like if I make eye contact with you, hold that eye contact, continue to hold that eye contact. You know what I'm saying to you is very important and meaningful. You know, as it turns out, there's a bunch of researchers, mainly from the Netherlands, who have figured out that we also communicate with each other via smell. You know, and you aren't apt to think about that, but when we're happy, when we're confident, it's whatever, we literally smell differently. And this isn't just because we're sweating more or less. You know, it's actually interesting. If you've got a good concentrator, someone who's good at concentrating, they will consistently emit a certain smell. And if you have a group that has trouble focusing, if you sit your concentrator among those who have trouble focusing, they focus better. So anyway, this is a reason for people to be co-located. That's why co-location and spending time together matters for connecting, and also for doing things like resolving difficult problems, like reasoning creatively, all that kind of thing, and bonding with others, as focus here. And I'm certain that ultimately, you know, the video conference products will get better, and maybe they'll transmit smells. You know, think about it. Like, I'm not sitting here holding my breath, you know, because really, basically, I know nothing about that kind of technology. So, but you know, so you can see that spending time together is really important. And I also want to make a point about not only individuals interacting, you know, with other individuals, just teams in general need to own a space in order for them to build trust among members, you know, that social connections and things like that. So particularly so if like you have an activity-based workplace where people can sit here, there, and whatever any particular day, you want to have each team have a home base. It might be an area of the floor. It might be a room with a door, whatever, because for them to really coalesce as a group, to really connect, they need that group-owned place. Now, biophilic design is generally a good thing. We spend a lot of time talking about biophilic design, but it's really important in terms of connecting between people, because being around other people really revs us up, makes us really energetic and energized. And we'll be so energized by being around we can be so energized by being around other people that our ability to connect with them, and therefore our well-being and all, is degraded. So you need often to have a physical environment that helps keep those energy levels in check. And those are spaces that are designed biophilically, with things like views out over the area from a protected space, natural materials, light, sounds, that kind of thing. And, you know, we can go beyond that to think about things such as having warmer, slightly dimmer lights, warmer colors, that all on walls. That all enhances our ability to socialize. Even having cushions on chairs, the curved elements I've talked about before are more likely to be present in biophilic spaces and spaces that support connections among people. And even things like, you need some extra chairs in places where people are supposed to connect. Humans start to get antsy when more than 70% of the seats in any area are occupied. Antsy is not connecting. So, you know, build in some empty seats. But we have to be careful when we're talking about bringing people together, because when individuals can see more than about 15 other people, or when they sense people are behind them, they're bonding with their teammates falls, they trust each other less, they share information with each other less, things like that. Sort of this crowding thing starts to happen. So, you know, there is a limit. And, you know, we can talk about other ways that you can foster connection between people. As it turns out, when we smell the smell of lavender, we're more likely to trust other people. That's great for connecting. When we're in a space that's like a conservatory, you know, with plants and stuff like that, we are more likely to feel positively, feel closer to the people who are nearby, etc., than when we're in a place like a mall. So now we get to our final topic, which is good because we're getting towards our final time. But anyway, now we're going to talk a little bit about navigating change and the neuroscience of how you can support people while they're navigating change. And surprise, surprise, some things that we've talked about before will come up again. And first of all, in terms of change, it seems somehow logical, at least to me as a psychologist, to first talk about the opposite of change, which is familiarity. People feel most comfortable in places that seem familiar to them, that are predictable, and that are understandable. This doesn't mean that a place has to be exactly the same as a previous place, but you have to be able to walk into it and understand what the hell you're supposed to do there, how you're supposed to use it, where are you supposed to put yourself, your stuff, etc. Unfamiliar places and situations are generally preferred. But there's some variations. For example, people are likely to feel slightly more adventurous and have less preference for the familiar when they're in a more positive mood than when they're in a more negative mood. So you can think about how this would relate. We can pick some non-workplace examples for a change. So like if you're talking about a place where people might hold a wedding reception, you can, press the limit out there a little bit, be a little less familiar. But like a funeral home, that's not the point for experimentation. Very predictable environment will make people feel better, because when people are stressed, they get super into the familiar. And you also, before we leave this topic, we have to remember that what people say they like is, surprise, surprise, not what they actually like. If you ask people what they wish, they'll tell you, oh, they like avant-garde this and, unusual that. And when you get right down to it, no, they do not. And when you give them the avant-garde and the blah, 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 often they're unhappy. Unhappy means trouble with well-being, connecting, and also dealing with change. And just as a general point, because there's nothing quite so important as running over time-wise, we can think about the fact that we prefer what's familiar to us today, but also if you think about biophilic design, we also have a preference and respond very positively to what was familiar to us in the past. Now, when we think about change, it's important to think about the bonds that people have to a place. This gets into things like place attachment and a lot of really cool, interesting topics that, of course, we can't go through in detail today. But bonds to places are really powerful, and they can't be ignored. If you say, oh, they won't care if we move them, or they won't care if we change everything in their spot, whatever. Well, yes, they do care, and they respond negatively, and the unnamed they, do not deal well with that change. But when people are in a place to which they've bonded, they're in a better mood, they're mentally refreshed, and they'll also keep the place better, if you will. They won't, fiddle with it, no graffiti, etc. And people are more likely to bond to a place when it says something about them that they value, and we've spent a lot of time today talking about nonverbal communication, so you get what I'm getting at there, and also when a place supports what they want to do. So again, we've talked a lot about aligning design with activity today. So sometimes it really is time for a change. And sometimes it's very clear when you need to make a change, like your organization buys another organization and you're going to have to mix people from a lot of different cultures in the same spaces, for example, or there's some sort of technology thing that happens. That's sort of easy. You have to make changes then. But in general, you would know that you need to make changes when a place, a design, doesn't support people's, and we could say it all together by now, when it doesn't support their competence, their capability, their feeling of control, or their ability to relate to each other in the way they wish to do. And, in most organizations, there's continuing relationships, gathering information from users, and you'd be figuring out that this was the situation. And so when you need to make a change, you need to make sure that the new space aligns with people's tasks, what they need to accomplish, gives them a feeling of control, allows them to socialize. But you can't forget some other things, like you can't forget that people are members of different cultures, national cultures, for example, a culture might be more individualistic or collectivistic. People from more individualistic cultures where, well, they're not very good at sharing, as it turns out. Surprise, surprise. So in terms of things like sharing printers or whatever, they don't respond very well to that. You can think about that in terms of positively navigating change. People from more individualistic cultures also expect more privacy than people from more collectivist cultures. So if you're making a change, you need to keep this in mind. We can also think about aligning a place with users' personality. The probable personality of users can usually be found in a space like scholar.google.com if you go and pose this question. And there are three aspects of personality that are really important for design. For example, if people are more extroverted or introverted, people who are extroverted, I'm extroverted, we just don't do a very good job processing the sensory information that we receive. So therefore, we do great in a space where there's more going on from a sensory perspective compared to people who are more introverted, who are better at processing that information. Therefore, you need to more carefully curate the experiences they have. And there's ripples all through this, like people who are extroverted, we love a sofa. We can sit and we can scooch over closer to you, because we aren't very good with personal space either, But people who are more introverted, they would like a chair with some really nice arms there. There you go. Or it even relates to art. People who are extroverted can get into art that shows people. Introverts, not so much. So, we can talk about extroversion, introversion, openness to experience, conscientiousness, but for Mark's sake, who's worried about the time, we will not. But, in general, it's also important to make the point that users need to know why a choice is being made, because otherwise they don't attach to the place. It's distinct from their identity, and you don't get all sorts of the benefits we talked about earlier. But it's also, just in passing, I would say that if you think about biophilic environments, they have change built right into them on different scales, and we have a really positive response to those changes. Like, think about circadian lighting that changes in the course of the day. We also like natural materials that develop a patina over time, etc. So there definitely is a place for change in our life. So to recap the core issues, really it gets back to sort of, I guess, the first real slide that we had. We need to design a space that provides people with the ability to succeed at whatever they've set out to do, gives them a feeling of control over their environment, allows them to mix socially with other people when they choose to do so. And when we have environments that do those things, those environments support people's well-being, foster connections, and allow people to positively navigate change. And now it's time for questions. And if you have a question that pops into your mind on the way home or whatever, don't hesitate to send me an email. I would love to talk to you, email, and resolve whatever outstanding issues that you have. So what sort of questions do we have, Mark? And I'm only 2 minutes late getting to this.
Yeah, you've done a great job. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Yeah, the expert in me is loving this.
So if you've got any questions in the room, I need to hand you the microphone so that people can hear you. But online, I have some questions. And Monique's asked about a couple of sources of your research. Yeah. One about where the research sits about creativity, and I will share the video that you did for us last year. But where does that research sit? All those boxes. Is that based on a whole load of research?
Yeah, it comes from a body of research. Everything I said can ultimately be traced to one peer review study or another. It all comes out of the rigorously derived scientific material. Some of the sources I can name off the top of my head, like the ones for the color green. Others I would want to look up before I actually said them out loud, but it all ties back to science sooner or later. And I think last year when I was talking about creativity, I actually mentioned some of them in the course of what I said. So
Great, thank you. And we did say that if those questions come up, we may add them to the follow-up email as well. So
for sure.
yeah, and the other one was around the numbers of where you kind of said that if 16 people or 15 people are in front of you,
Right.
you know, someone said, you know, where does that come from?
Right, sure.
That's that I vouch for what you've said.
Right.
Where's the research for that?
Right. When I was making that point, I was combining information from studies done by a researcher who, the first researcher on one of the studies, their last name is Brunia. I don't remember all of the other researchers there. And another study that I was talking about in that same paragraph was done by Kirsten Saylor at University College London and her associates. So I'd be happy to supply this information if it's needed.
Great. Yeah, and Kirsten does some great work around space syntax.
Yeah, Kirsten is really cool work.
Great, thank you. Debbie says it's difficult for people to demonstrate non-verbal communication about themselves and displaying awards because they have non-allocated workstations. Thoughts on how you can identify yourself if you're not in a workstation, you know, give about your individual identity.
Right. Well, I mean, you know, there's all sorts of ways you can do that. If you don't have an assigned workplace, most of them, like if you don't have places to put things, you can't put them up. Sometimes people are allowed at their organizations to customize the front of their locker. So even though they don't have an assigned place, they do have an assigned locker that they customize. But as a psychologist, I really like for people to have an assigned desk whenever it's at all reasonably possible to do so. Because just as I was mentioning that teams function more effectively when they have an own space, so do individuals. It gives our primitive little, you know, chipmunk mind one less thing to think about when we're in a space that we own. So for maximum performance, well-being, etc., I really like people to have an assigned seat.
And that is backed up by the research that Nigel Oserland did for us recently, which
there are many studies that talk about
this. People with allocated desks are happy in every area of their work than those with unallocated desks.
Yeah, I sometimes make this sort of joke that if you're trying to think about if a person would be successful or happy in a space, think about whether a chipmunk. You don't have chipmunks in Europe, no. So maybe you think about squirrels or something. Think about if a squirrel would be happy there, because when we were a young species, we weren't really very different in how we experienced the world than a squirrel is today. We were social beasts, but we survived based on our wits and knowing when danger was around and that kind of thing. So, like, would a squirrel want to sit in a seat where people walk behind them all day? No, he would not. And humans don't. That stresses us out, degrades our well-being, you know, to align with the talk today. So,
has anyone got any questions in the room? Otherwise, I've got more. Any?
I have a question. Yes.
Hang on a second. You need the microphone. Yes.
Thank you. I really liked your comment when you said what people say they like won't necessarily always be what they do actually like.
Right.
Do you have any recommendations of how we can work out what people need? So you've got a traditional survey or something like that, but is there anything more out there that you'd recommend organisations doing to work out what their people really need?
Just to make a more general point, and you can ask follow-up questions if I'm off target. I think asking people survey questions is really lovely, but often when people answer the survey questions, they're sort of gaming the whole situation. Like, I want to keep my assigned seat, so I'm going to answer this question in this way, whether I actually think that's true or not. So therefore, I'm a big fan of, if you possibly have the time and the money, to go out and do observations in workplaces. And observations, you know, targeted observations looking for very specific things that are relevant to your outstanding question can you know, take a variety of different lengths of time and therefore cost different amounts of money. Like if you just go out and walk around, if we walked around here for 20 minutes, we would learn a lot more, and we know a lot more than we did 20 minutes before. If you can spend a whole day incrementally more, like if you look at like what academics tell you you have to walk around and do observations till you can anticipate what anybody you might run into might do next. And that's really lovely if you're an academic, but that's like takes as much time as doing a dissertation. We can't do that. So, think beforehand about what you need to learn. Go out and look, keep something of an open mind, but go out and look for information that relates to your outstanding issue and spend the time doing it that the budget allows.
Yeah, and they're doing that observation of what they say they do and then what they actually do.
That gets away from what they say.
Yeah.
So, I mean, and there's tech terms for like things you'd see like if you're actually out there observing, you'll see, how they treat their desks, whatever, what they put up, how they actually interact with people. Like, do they have to talk to people? Some people do jobs. There's some jobs where you really don't need to talk very much to other people, but we often infer that everybody needs to collaborate all the time. Anyway, but you can also look for signs of where, like, is there like a weird scuffing on something that indicates like that people are like building barricades to separate themselves from each other sometimes. I mean, you see this stuff when you go out, and when you see like the weird scuffing, you can sort of politely ask around to see how it happened to come about. And if you find out people are, I mean, like I've been places where people, they don't hate each other, but they literally build barricades between each other for various psychological reasons. And that's important. And that's not going to come through on a survey question, probably.
Yeah, and Brian, you do make a good point. We've got to make the right survey questions as well. So that's
that's one of the things I did as a job when I was finishing up my dissertation. And there really is a science to creating a non-leading question, whatever. But even when a question is not leading and follows a bunch of other rules, the 10,000 rules for survey questions, people can still answer with an objective in mind, besides providing you the answer that you're actually seeking.
Okay, this is a tough question. Samantha asks,
okay,
based on data and high-level perspective, what are the top 5 variables in a workplace that enhance employee well-being, like lighting, quality? So you could choose the top 5 things. Let's say the top 3 because of the time.
Okay,
the things that matter, that make the most difference.
Well, the first thing is the signaling, and you have to talk to people to figure out what signaling is actually happening, because it does really seem that if people feel valued, like their organization cares about them, they'll walk through fire, they'll do all sorts of things for you. So that's really important. Beyond that, the next thing I would think about is ventilation, which is something, we really didn't get a chance to talk about today. But if your brain can't work right, because you're not getting enough of the right sort of air, well, that doesn't do very much for your well-being. So, and while you're fiddling with your ventilation system, you can also work in smells that would support well-being. You can use artificial scents, so you don't have to worry about allergies, so that's sort of a bonus when you're fiddling with the ventilation. And then after that, I would start to think about acoustics in terms of distractions and stress. So those are the first 3 things I would plow through.
Thank you very much. We are at the end of our hour, which has gone very, very quickly. There will be a follow-up email with some links to some of the research that's been referred to, as well as Sally's slide deck. As you leave today, you will be taken to a website where you can give us feedback, and do check out our upcoming webinars. And in fact, one of the things that Sally talked about was about relationships at work, and next month's webinar is called Relationship-Based Work, where we're suggesting as an organization here that it adds on to activity-based working, and that is really important. So thank you for those in the room, and thank you for those online for session. But most of all, Sally, thank you very much for your...
Thank you, and I hope it was useful. Thank you.